Iron Bottom Sound, off Guadalcanal. November 13, 1942, 1:24 am. 13 American warships move in a single column through water with no moon and no horizon, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, 8 destroyers. Radar picks up another formation, dead ahead, closing from the opposite direction. 13 Japanese ships. Among them, the battleship Hiei, 36,000 tons, 14-inch guns built to put rounds through the armored hull of another battleship, not to fight at close range against a 1,630-ton destroyer. The Americans are not there to fight a battleship. They are there to stop one. Hiei is carrying bombardment shells meant for Henderson Field, where 1,600 U.S. Marines hold an airstrip with 19 operational aircraft. If those shells land before dawn, the airstrip is finished, and so is the American position on Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan holds his course. He does not form a battle line. He does not issue a plan beyond a single order broadcast to the fleet. Odd-numbered ships fire to starboard. Even-numbered ships fire to port. 2 columns of warships are converging in total darkness, range closing by the second, and neither side yet knows how close the ships will get before the first shot is fired, or what a battleship does when a destroyer gets close enough to touch. By November 1942, the U.S. Navy already knew what night combat against the Imperial Japanese Navy cost. On August 9, in these same waters, a cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa surprised an Allied screening group off Savo Island. In 32 minutes, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sunk or left burning wrecks. 1,077 Americans and Australians were killed. Not one Japanese ship was lost. The lesson the Navy drew from Savo Island was straightforward. Japan owned the night. Japanese lookouts trained for years in darkened rooms to preserve their night vision. Japanese optics read the dark better than American radar could interpret it in the confusion of a close engagement. And Japanese destroyers carried the Type 93 torpedo American sailors called it the Long Lance, with a range past 20,000 yards, wakeless, nearly impossible to spot before it hit. The Navy's answer was to fight at range. New SG surface search radar was supposed to let American ships detect the enemy first and open fire from a distance, before Japanese optics and torpedoes closed the gap. It had already failed once. At Cape Esperance 5 weeks earlier, radar contact was made early, and the engagement still collapsed into chaos. 1 American cruiser was hit by fire from her own side. By November, officers in the South Pacific were treating these waters as a place that took ships and did not give them back. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, running the South Pacific Theater, had grown reluctant to commit surface forces here at all, and would be relieved of command within days, in part over exactly that hesitation. Standing off at range and trading gunfire had been tried twice, at Savo Island and Cape Esperance, and both times American radar advantage had been erased by darkness, confusion, or friendly fire before it could be used. Naval War College doctrine, going back a decade, had assumed any future Pacific War would be decided by battleships slugging it out at long range in daylight, the way Jutland was fought in 1916. Destroyers existed in that doctrine to screen the battle line and launch torpedoes from a distance, not to fight capital ships directly. Nothing in pre-war planning accounted for a formation of cruisers and destroyers with no battleship of their own, sent to physically block a pair of enemy battleships in a narrow, pitch-black channel. Nobody in the U.S. Navy had a tested alternative to offer Callahan's task force that night. There was no rehearsed close-range doctrine, no fleet exercise proving a destroyer could survive inside a battleship's minimum gun range, only 2 failed attempts at fighting from a distance, and 13 ships steaming forward regardless. because Henderson Field could not be given up without a fight of some kind. Commanding the destroyer USS Laffey that night was Lieutenant Commander William E. Hank, 34 years old, a 1930 Naval Academy graduate who had spent his career almost entirely on destroyers, small, fast, undergunned ships that survive by using speed and position, not armor. Hank had brought Laffey out of commissioning in early 1942 and run her through months of gunnery and torpedo drills built around a single idea: a destroyer's 5-inch guns and torpedo tubes were only decisive if the range was short enough that the enemy's advantages stopped mattering. At range, a battleship's 14-inch guns and thicker armor won every time. Inside a few hundred yards, none of that helped. A battleship's main battery cannot depress far enough to hit a target running directly alongside it, and a destroyer's smaller, faster firing guns can rake an exposed bridge in seconds. It was not a doctrine the Navy had adopted. It was the working assumption of a destroyer captain who had spent a year training his crew to fight at a range most of the fleet considered suicidal, because he had concluded it was the only range at which his ship's weaknesses stopped being weaknesses. Laffey herself was brand new, commissioned in February 1942, barely 9 months old by the time she entered Iron Bottom Sound. She had already screened carriers at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and escorted transport convoys into Guadalcanal under air attack, which meant her crew had combat experience, but almost none of it at the close range Hank drilled for. What set Hank apart was not a dramatic personal history. It was a habit. He ran his gun crews through drills timed to the second, insisting they be able to shift target and depression fast enough to track a ship passing within a few hundred yards, a skill nobody expected a destroyer captain to need against a battleship. On the night it mattered, that was the one skill his ship actually used. There was no single moment where close the range became American doctrine. It formed inside the chaos of the approach itself, ship by ship, largely because Callahan's formation had no other option left once contact was made without a plan. Truer fleet exercises had penalized aggressive close-range maneuvering against capital ships. Closing on a battleship was treated in fleet problem critiques as a way to lose destroyers for no return, and commanders who tried it were marked down for recklessness rather than praised for initiative. The institutional logic was sound on paper. More armor and bigger guns should win at any range. Nobody had tested what happened when a formation got so close that a battleship's main battery became a liability instead of an asset. The idea nearly died before the first shot was fired. As the two columns closed to under 3,000 yards, several American ships held fire, uncertain whether the ships ahead were Japanese or their own destroyers screening out front. Requests to open fire were passed up the chain and delayed while contacts were checked against known American positions. A few more seconds of hesitation on either side would have let the range close to nothing before anyone was ready to shoot, or worse, opened fire on their own formation in a channel already crowded with ships nobody could positively identify. What actually broke the hesitation was not a decision from Callahan. It was distance itself. By the time anyone could confirm the ships ahead were Japanese, the range had already closed past the point where standing off and opening fire from a distance was still an option. The formations were inside each other's minimum effective range before either commander had chosen to put them there. The tactic that would decide the battle was not selected, it was what remained once every other option had run out of room. There had been no live test of fighting a battleship at point-blank range before that night, only the failure of standing off, twice, at Savo Island and Cape Esperance. The proof, when it came in real time, under fire, with no way to call it off. At 1:48 a.m., the range had closed to almost nothing. Japanese searchlights snapped on, catching the destroyer Cushing in the beam first. American ships opened fire within seconds of being illuminated, at ranges some officers later logged at under 1,000 yards point blank for naval gunfire that had been designed to fight at 10 or 20 times that distance. The proof of the tactic came immediately and brutally. At that range, American 5-inch guns could put rounds directly into the exposed bridges and searchlight crews of much larger Japanese ships, doing damage the same guns could never have managed at standoff range. USS Atlanta, hit by a torpedo and then raked by dozens of shells, a portion of them believed to be American, fired by ships that could not identify her in the dark, would lose Rear Admiral Norman Scott, killed on her own bridge. Aboard San Francisco, Callahan himself would be killed within the hour, hit by fire believed to have come from the Japanese destroyer Asagumo. 2 American admirals were killed in a single night action, something that had not happened to the U.S. Navy in a single engagement since the Civil War. If you're watching this and want to see exactly how close one of those destroyers came to a battleship built to sink her, and what her crew did with the few minutes they had, that's what happens next. The complication came almost as fast as the proof did. With visibility down to a few hundred yards and 13 ships firing in nearly every direction, several American vessels could not reliably tell friendly ships from Japanese ones. Fire discipline broke down inside the first 10 minutes. The same closeness that let American gunners rake Japanese bridges at point-blank range also meant American shells were landing on American ships. The tactic that was working against the enemy was, in the same chaotic minutes, costing the U.S. Navy losses it had not planned for. USS Laffey is running north when Hiei appears out of the dark, close enough that her silhouette fills the horizon. Hank does not turn away. He holds course, passing down Hiei's port side at a range some survivors would later estimate at under 50 yards, close enough that Hiei's main battery cannot depress low enough to bring her 14-inch guns to bear. Laffey opens fire with everything she has: 5-inch guns, 20mm cannon, 50-caliber machine guns rake Hiei's bridge and superstructure at point-blank range. On Hiei's bridge, Vice Admiral Hiroki Abe is wounded. Several of his staff officers are killed outright. For a battleship built to dominate an engagement at 20,000 yards, the range has collapsed to a few dozen, and at that range, her advantage in armor and gun caliber does nothing for her exposed bridge crew. Sailors on both ships are close enough to see each other. Japanese crewmen fire rifles and pistols back at Laffey's bridge. It is, for a few minutes, not artillery war at all. It is 2 crews shooting at each other across open water, close enough to have shouted. Gunners on both sides too near their target to miss, and too near it to fully protect themselves either. Elsewhere in the same channel, the destroyer Cushing and other American ships are locked in their own point-blank exchanges. Distinguishing one column from the other by sight alone, in darkness broken only by muzzle flashes and burning ships, has become close to impossible for everyone involved. Japanese and American alike, Laffey turns to clear the battleship's side, and the range that saved her against Hiei's main guns does not save her from what comes next. A torpedo strikes her stern. Shellfire from other Japanese ships follows, wrecking her steering and starting fires that reach her depth charges. At roughly 2:15 am, with the ship unable to be saved, Hank gives the order to abandon ship. Laffey sinks a short time later. Of a crew of approximately 259 men are killed. Hiei survives the night, but her steering gear is wrecked, struck either by Laffey or by one of the other American destroyers in the same minutes, and she is left circling, unable to maneuver, off Guadalcanal at daylight. A battleship that entered the Sound to bombard an airstrip cannot now steer her own course. Before that night, No Imperial Japanese Navy battleship had been lost in the Pacific War. By the following evening, after repeated airstrikes from Henderson Field's surviving aircraft and from carrier Enterprise, Hiei is sunk or scuttled, the first Japanese battleship lost since the war began. Brought down not by a battleship of her own class, but by a formation that had nothing bigger than a heavy cruiser, closing a range no one had planned to close. The first naval battle of Guadalcanal cost the U.S. Navy 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, including Laffey, and 2 admirals killed in a single night. Japan lost 2 destroyers outright, and, within 24 hours, the battleship Hiei, a loss with no precedent in the war to that point. Henderson Field's bombardment shells never landed. The airstrip stayed operational, and its aircraft helped finish off a Japanese troop convoy 2 days later, a result that historians generally treat as the turning point of the Guadalcanal campaign. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again risk a battleship that close to Guadalcanal in daylight. What decided the battle was not a new weapon or a new doctrine written down beforehand. It was 13 ships that ran out of room to maneuver and close the distance, instead of opening it, turning a battleship's biggest advantage, her main battery, into the one thing she couldn't use. A note on sourcing, figures on casualties, ranges, and timing in accounts of this action vary between sources. Some survivor estimates of range and time differ from official action reports. The core sequence above reflects the widely documented record, but exact numbers should be cross-checked against primary sources before final production if precision is required for narration.